Greetings from Shar Al Sheikh and welcome to this very important event, the role of blended finance and public-private partnership in the fight against climate change. My name is Emre Tiftik, Director of Sustainability Research at the Institute of International Finance. Thanks again for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for their generous support for this webinar. With that, I am delighted to welcome the Mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, Justin Bibb, who will join us for a fireside chat here. Mayor Bibb serves as an advisory board member for the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he is the vice chair for climate and resilience on the Environment Committee. Welcome, Mayor Bibb. It's wonderful to see you here.
Thank you so much, Emory, for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Let's start with a simple question. Please tell us, do you see climate change as an important threat for the city of Cleveland and more broadly for the United States?
Absolutely. Cleveland is a North Coast city. We're right on the shores of the Great Lake Erie. And so we see issues of losing our coastline to water erosion. We also see an increase in storm water-related events all across our city and across the entire region. And this is all as a result of an increase in climate change. The other thing that keeps me up at night as mayor is the high rates of asthma that we see in our city, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods in Cleveland. And so we're really focused on enhancing and developing our tree canopy to make sure we can address some of the heat islands and heat deserts we see in Cleveland. We're also really focused on making sure that the benefits of the green economy and green energy are more broad-based and more focused on racial equity to ensure all of our residents can experience the benefits and not the challenges that we see with climate change that's not just facing Cleveland, but the entire country.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I would like us to talk a little bit about the progress. I know that Cleveland has some commitments about clean energy. I just wonder whether you are on track to reach 100% clean and renewable energy by 2050 and or maybe even earlier?
Well, when I ran for mayor last year, I ran on the campaign slogan of Cleveland can't wait. And so when it comes to making sure that the city is really on track to be 100% clean and renewable by 2050, I gave my administration a mandate to change that to 2030 because we need to have a sense of urgency around this issue. And so we're moving up our target timeline. We're working with organizations like Sustainable Development Solutions Network USA and other key stakeholders to really advance this timeline, be more targeted in our goals to ensure that the city of Cleveland has a clear plan to advance clean and equitable energy all across our city.
This is extremely encouraging for our audience. I mean, especially your targets are very ambitious and also comprehensive. But of course, I believe achieving these commitments, targets requires you find a way to mobilize capital in a much more effective way, which needs to come also from private sector. So I just want to hear your views about how can we scale up public-private partnership for climate action. I know you have done lots of work on that in your previous career as well. So would appreciate your views on this topic.
Well, I want to just first start off with what I think are the key ingredients to a successful public-private partnership. Number one, alignment. So what do I mean by that? How do we make sure that all of our key stakeholders that are really focused on climate change have shared goals, a shared sense of accountability, and a shared problem that we're working to solve? Because we as mayors, due to finite resources and, trust me, finite time, we can't boil the ocean. And so making sure that there's shared alignment, shared accountability, shared goals, and a shared problem that we're working on around to solve is so essential. I think secondly, trust. We see this in the data right now, whether it be a lack of trust in government, a lack in trust in the private sector, a lack in trust of any historical institution in civil society. When we don't build trust, we can't solve these problems. One of my favorite quotes is that change moves at the speed of trust. And so once you get that shared alignment, you got to make sure that there's trust between your partners around the table to truly build successful public-private partnerships. And the last thing I would say that's so critical is you got to have a big, bold, audacious goal, right? To inspire people to truly build a coalition of the willing to get big things done. And I think with those three ingredients, there is nothing stopping our potential as a city and as civil society in terms of tackling these key barriers around climate change that face humanity all across the world right now.
Wow, excellent. So alignment, trust, and ambitious goals to convince, to move people. I love it. So, and of course, I mean, you are absolutely right. We all have a big role to play in this journey. I call it as a journey. So, but what is your message to the private sector? I mean, so what would you like to see from the private sector, and especially from financial services industry in this journey to low carbon economy?
Yeah. Well, before becoming mayor, I spent nearly 15 years working in the private sector, both in banking and in strategy consulting. And whether I was advising large publicly traded companies or working at a large bank, one of the things that was a challenge for us in the private sector was we were always competing quarter by quarter, right? We got to maximize returns every quarter to maximize shareholder value. And that's important, right? That's the number one fiduciary responsibility, maximizing shareholder capital. But what I think is needed now more than ever in this space, particularly from the financial services sector, is how do you put patient capital to work, leveraging your balance sheets to support mayors and leaders at the local level to get big stuff done to address climate change, and really being creative about the financing. One of the challenges we have is that there's so many rules and regulations about how we can spend public money in localities all across the United States. But really partnering with our banking sector to deploy capital in a more innovative, bold, aggressive way, I think will allow us to tackle some of these problems in an accelerated fashion. And so I think that's one opportunity, I think that's low-hanging fruit for mayors working with the banking sector to really put capital to work in a prudent way to really address this. Could be, I think, a thing that everyone could benefit from long term.
Excellent. I know you don't have too much time with us today, but before you leave, I just want to ask you a broader question. In the US, there are lots of discussions about ESG backlash. Yeah. I just wonder whether this discussion can be an opportunity in the sense that we can turn it to a much healthier discussion. So would appreciate your views on this.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we see with some of the ESG backlash is just a lack of honest, authentic conversation about the facts. And these policy conversations happen in the ivory tower or happen in vacuums without bringing all the key stakeholders together. And so we got to do a better job of just level setting the conversation and really talk about the why and the end goal in mind, first and foremost. I would also say that, what the private sector needs is predictability in the marketplace, right? And so how do we structure these rules and regulations to achieve our climate change policy goals, but do it in a way that allows the private sector to have predictability in the marketplace. So it's a win-win. And then thirdly, whether you are, a large institutional investor or a teacher who's trying to make sure that their 401k has the maximum return for their retirement, that also has an important social benefit and social impact. We got to get back to the basics and really talk about why this is important in a way that any stakeholder can understand, whether it be that teacher who's saving for a 401k or that large institutional investor. And a lot of times we're not having that conversation. And so I think it's important for really us around this Zoom roundtable to really be at the forefront of pushing the envelope and pushing those conversations long term.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's all about having conversation. I mean, so this is the only way to find the ground. This is the only way to increase awareness. So, and again, in this sustainable finance field, I think everything starts with raising the awareness. This is excellent. I just want to thank you so much. I know you have a busy schedule. This is really, really great honor for us to have you here. I hope we will have you in another platform, maybe in person. So thank you so much, Mayor Bibb.
Well, I want to just leave with a couple closing comments. One, I wish I could join you for COP27 in Egypt, but as you know, my first year as mayor, I got to make sure I'm ready for the snow. So sorry I can't join you. But then secondly, it's important to note that Cleveland as a city has always been at the vanguard and forefront of America's fight towards climate justice and climate resiliency. 50 years ago, right here, our river, the Cuyahoga River, caught on fire. That led to the first Black elected mayor of a major American city of Cleveland, Carl Stokes, to do a nationwide pollution tour to talk about the importance of clean drinking waters in cities like Cleveland, which led to the Clean Water Act, which eventually led to the EPA. So Cleveland has always been at the heart of this conversation, and I look forward to carrying the baton for the next generation to fight for climate justice, not just in Cleveland, but all across the world. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, at this time, let us turn to our panel discussion. Today, we have Tim Clausen. Tim is the head of international regulatory policy at HSBC. Next, we have Ricardo De Vecchi Galindo, who is the head of public-private partnerships and sustainable infrastructure unit at IDB Invest. We have Fumihiko Ito. He's the Group Chief Sustainability Officer at Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. And finally, we have also Jeff Shoup, Sustainable Finance Integration Leader at Wells Fargo. Welcome all. It's great to have you all here today. I would like to start the discussion with you, Jeff. Could you please tell us what is the landscape for climate finance in the US? We heard some ideas from Mayor Justin earlier, but from your perspective, how effective are public-private partnerships in mobilizing the most needed capital for climate action in the US?
Yeah, and thank you so much for the question and for having me on the panel. I think broadly speaking, the landscape for climate finance in the US is very, very strong and very robust, and it's only going to get stronger and more liquid with the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Breaking it down a little bit, I think most specifically, there is an enormous amount of private capital going towards the most mature, most proven out technologies for climate change, which in the US is utility scale wind and solar projects and increasingly battery storage. There is an enormous amount of institutional private capital flowing to those markets. And with the passage of the IRA, which includes these significant new incentives, we're already starting to see interest in capital flowing to new waves of technologies related to EV and battery manufacturing real strong growth of supply chains with over like $20 billion of announced investments just from the passage of that bill, as well as more interest in rapidly growing sort of capital flows towards technologies like green hydrogen and a lot of interest in things like carbon capture as well. At the other end of the spectrum, there is still strong investment in venture capital space for climate-related companies. Earlier in the year, there was a fear or an expectation that a lot of that venture investment was going to drop on the expectation there would be a recession. And the overall level of climate-related investment in the VC space has actually remained strong. So there are still two places that I think are the most significant gaps where there needs to be more support from the public sector. One is the space in between, which can broadly call the commercialization gap or commercialization valley of death, where there are newer technologies that might even be proven out from a technical perspective, but have not been deployed in a commercial setting to prove that they are, quote, bankable for a bank like Wells Fargo, for example. And then the other area, which is one that the mayor touched on, is for deploying proven technologies into low-income and BIPOC communities that are chronically underserved when it comes to clean energy access, even though those are the communities where they have the highest energy burden. So I think those are particularly ripe areas for public investment. And when it comes to public-private investment, public-private partnerships as the mechanism, I think there's questions about the role that that mechanism can play versus blended finance. From Wells Fargo's perspective, we actually were able to participate in a really innovative P3 activity earlier this year with Washington, D.C., the capital city in the U.S., leading the underwriting of a $150 million tax-exempt private activity bond that allowed the District of Columbia then to contract out to a third party to do a full replacement of tens of thousands of streetlights to convert to LED, which would produce significant electricity bill savings as well as emissions reductions. So for Wells Fargo, we're comfortable and familiar with P3. I believe that was the first P3 of its kind in North America that did a streetlight conversion. So there are places like that, particularly when we're talking about publicly owned assets, where traditional public-private partnerships can be valuable and important for addressing climate change. In the US, it happens to be that the vast majority of the assets that are generating or have an emissions profile are privately owned. Our power sector is almost entirely owned by the private sector. And so the application of public-private partnerships is not irrelevant, but I think it's more likely that we're going to see blended finance structures come into play. And again, the Inflation Reduction Act includes actually $27 billion in what's called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is effectively the creation of a new national green bank that's similar to ones we've seen in Australia and previously in the UK and at the state level around the country. And so I think we're going to see a significant growth in blended finance structures that are going to be really well suited to targeting the kinds of gaps that I identified earlier.
Wow, excellent. Thanks, Jeff. I think it was a great way to start our panel discussion today. Let me turn to you, Fumihiko, here, and maybe you can share some views from Japan. So Japan is one of the most affected places by climate change. I mean, so we all know that, and the temperature rises are much more significant over there relative to the rest of the world. And I just wonder how resilient to climate change is the infrastructure in Japan, and what are the key aspects of scaling public-private partnerships for climate action in Japan?
Thank you for your question, Emily-san. Yeah, you are right. Japan's average temperature has risen by about 1.3 degrees over the past 100 years. Compared with the rising global temperature of about 0.7 degrees. So I understand that this is largely due to the geographical reasons, the fact that Japan is located in an area where increase in temperature is relatively high. Nevertheless, currently the Japanese government and companies keep taking this as a given condition and proceed with more climate change adaptation measures. For example, in order to respond to the intensification and frequency of water disaster caused by climate change, the government has been working with residents and local authorities to strengthen infrastructure around rivers according to each regional characteristic. In fact, Tokyo and other urban areas in Japan have experienced a series of heavy rains in recent years that are believed to be caused by climate change, but we were able to avoid flooding of major rivers and minimize damage so far. However, Japan's population concentration in urban area is remarkable on a global scale. So there is a greater need to take measures to adapt to climate change while continuing to develop social infrastructure, including green infrastructure, and to secure sustainable living spaces. However, the government and the public sector now is facing difficulty to provide finance due to financial burden. So, therefore, we can say that the role of private sector now is growing in strengthening infrastructure in Japan. Under these circumstances, the key point of a public-private partnership is that both sectors build a sense of mutual trust, and that risk are appropriately shared. And please note that private capital need to be bankable. So, and in order to do so, it is important to reduce risks by gaining financial and administrative support from the public sector. That's what we are thinking.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Ricardo, let me bring you into the discussion here. So could you tell us more about your experience at IDB Invest regarding the public-private partnerships? Especially, can you give us some success stories, so some examples? And more broadly, again, earlier, Jeff also mentioned a little bit about blended finance. So, but for our audience, so what is the difference between P3, public-private partnership, and blended finance?
Thank you, Andre. And thanks also to the IAF for the invitation. Thanks also to Tatiana and to the rest of the panelists. And I would like to start to answer your question from the end to the beginning. So your last question was about blended finance and PPPs and how they differ. And just to set the chord, if I may, I'm going to use I'm going to define both blended and PPPs, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences. First, and for the blended finance definition, I'm going to go with Convergence. Convergence is the working group for DFIs that has a blended finance definition. And what they say is that blended finance is a way to mobilize or to use concessional finance to mobilize investment into projects. So what we have here is we use blended finance when projects have a high risk, or the relationship between the returns and the risks is not as attractive for investors as it would be to similar projects. So blended finance per se is an instrument to enhance the financing side of projects. For example, if you're talking about an infrastructure project, let's say a solar panel, installation of solar farm in any country. So what you see there is that what blended finance can do, if it's a country where you've never done solar plants before. So what you can use blended finance here to get into the financing mix, blend with regular resources from banks or from any other investors that are investing in this project, and then use that to either extend the tenure of the loan or diminish the interest rate, for example. So that will make it more attractive and will reduce the risk for investors. So so it's just an example to see how blended finance operates in the investment side of projects. Now PPPs are different. PPPs are a procurement method, and what PPPs do is it's a relationship between the public and the private sector, in which the public tells the private, please do for me the financing, the plan. It can be any of these combinations, but the planning, the financing, the operation and the maintenance of an asset or of a project for a limited period of time. And your payment method will be either the use of the asset by the public, say a highway, for example, and the tolls in a highway, or me as the government are going to pay you, private sector, a little bit of resources, or not a little bit resources. We're going to pay you every 3, 6, etc. months if you comply with KPIs. So this is a procurement method. So this both blended and PPPs, they work to mobilize investment. They do it in different realms though. One in the procurement side and the other one in the financing side. I'm just going to go quick to what we do on PPPs in particular, which is what I do at IDB Invest, which is a private arm of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. So we finance mostly private projects. And what we do is that we've seen that in Latin America as a group, there's a 2.2 trillion gap to reach the sustainable development goals in this region. And not only that, besides that gap, you also need an additional 4 to 5% investment to make these assets resilient to climate change. So there's no way the public sector is going to do this, either because they don't have enough financing to do it, or and as well, there's no expertise to develop some of these projects that are needed to reach SDGs. So what we do at IDB Invest is we work together with our counterparts in the public side in IDB to bring a streamlined process to support PPPs from soup to nuts. So we help governments build a regulation for PPPs, build a pipeline for PPPs, and then together with them, we structure PPPs. We structure the tender processes for PPPs. And then on the financing side, we finance PPPs not only with regular loans, we also provide warranties, or we go into the capital markets with special bonds. So we do the soup to nuts approach. And for example, just to finish, just for IDB Invest, in the structuring side, we have structured several projects in Latin America. We structured a 6 billion package PPPs in Argentina some 5 or 6 years ago, going to develop a series of highways in that country. We also helped in Peru the development of wastewater plants in Lima and the surrounding area of the capital city of Peru. And on the public side, on the investment side, we have worked together with our clients in the private sector, financing, for example, the Port of Urabá in Colombia, which is a big port in the Gulf of Urabá, and it's going to bring a lot of development in parts of Colombia. And so, this is just an example, just a quick example. I can go into details if you ask, but it's more or less what we do. And finally, just to mention the thing about PPPs are also to better assign the risk in projects. So there are risks that are in an infrastructure project, there are risks that are better absorbed or taken by the public player, and there's also risks that can be taken by the private player. So PPPs are a way also to assign risk to the person or the entity that are better prepared to mitigate that risk.
Thank you so much for this clear explanation, but there's definitely lots to learn from you, and I'm sure that you have so much appetite from private sector to work with you guys. This is excellent. Tim, I know that HSBC co-chairs the B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force, and could you please go through the work of the task force a little bit for us? What are the priorities? How is it related with the public and private partnership projects?
Sure. Thanks very much, Emre. So the paper, the B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force paper hasn't been released yet, but I'll give a bit of a sense of what it's been up to and how it relates. So fundamentally, in the past, this task force would look at financial regulation, and they would also look at infrastructure issues. But this year, under the leadership of Pak Rida, who leads the Indonesian Sovereign Wealth Fund, his vision was to really focus this year on very much on blended finance and attracting investment to middle income countries, and specifically given the pipeline of presidencies to come. We've got Indonesia this year, we have India next year, and of course Brazil after that. So the makeup of the task force and the focus was very much more quite a lot narrower than usual. So very much focused on sort of infrastructure investment and a lot less sort of Basel III and the sort of stuff that a lot of my colleagues at the other big banks would typically nerd out on in this group. So to give a bit of a sense, I mean, you know, obviously we've been involved in the G20 for a while. Infrastructure is not a new topic. Blended finance is not a new topic. So the vision for the B20 in this group was to try and breathe some new life into an area that, you know, the G20 has been talking about for a long time, but we've not necessarily seen radical changes in the scale of financing that we're seeing through blended finance. So we've looked at some of the old topics, you know, boring but important topics, for example. So Ricardo mentioned before about pipelines. So we've looked at, you know, the importance, obviously, of credible investment pipelines, so that bid teams can assemble, you know, the engineering people, the construction people they need. All of this is, of course, critical if you're going to make progress. You need properly prepared projects and proper pipelines. So how could we breathe a bit of extra life into this? Well, we thought, well, maybe what we could do is we could get the World Bank to sort of randomly audit projects submitted to the G20 Global Infrastructure Pipeline Tool, for example. I guess the vision is, how can we create some peer pressure, a race to the top, to improve the quality of preparation and pipelines, rather than just have countries submit some wish lists, for example. So try and make them a bit more usable for investors. But we've also looked at a couple of other areas which are important, not being neglected entirely, but perhaps not had sufficient prominence. So one of the big areas for us, if you're involved on the financing side, is about ensuring that procurement is able to support innovation. So for blended finance, you know, we've got a lot of there's a desperate need for innovation to sort of see blended finance scale. And I guess, you know, we need innovation from governments, MDBs, banks, other investors. But for innovation to emerge and to succeed, it needs to be rewarded. And so one of the things we looked at in the task force was, the B20 task force was, you know, how can we ensure that bidders who come up with innovation are able to be rewarded? Now, this is tricky because a lot of countries have very clear procurement processes, and we don't want to sort of, you know, we don't want to cause trouble for like legitimate procurement, but at the same time, we need to ensure that bidders that come up with innovative strategies are able to be rewarded for them, rather than the country just saying, look, here's a cool strategy, who can deliver it for the least cost, sort of thing. So I think that's been another area of focus. And another one, of course, is on just the issue with foreign exchange. So for US dollars, it's so important. A lot of projects are long term. That requires hedging and swaps for the currency risk over long periods of time, and often the market infrastructure simply doesn't exist, even in many G20 countries. So the task force there, we wanted to focus on calling on the World Bank to sort of set out a roadmap. We're working with partners. I mean, I don't think the B20's you know, too philosophical about who, but we do need the G20 to have a plan, a roadmap to deliver some sort of cross MDB foreign exchange conversion facility. And the vision for that facility shouldn't be for us all to become addicted to it. It should be to ideally stimulate a commercial long-term foreign exchange market that eventually renders the facility redundant. That has to be the vision, I think. But anyway, as I say, the report's not yet public, but hopefully that gives you some sort of sense of what we've been up to, and it will be public in a couple of days' time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the key points from the report in advance with our audience. But yeah, I should tell you that these concerns about the strength of the dollar is a really hot topic also here in Egypt right now. I mean, so most of the EM debt, development markets, developing countries, outstanding debt is in the form of USD dollar. This makes them really, this puts them really in a difficult situation. I mean, makes it even much harder for them to finance their projects in dollar terms, and hedging should be really a priority. But thanks mentioning it. Jeff, I know you mentioned a little bit in your initial remarks about blended finance, but I want us to talk a little bit more about this within the concept of the United States. So I just want to know what needs to be done to scale blended finance. I mean, in mature markets. I mean, typically, whenever we talk about blended finance, people think about emerging markets, but actually, this tool is not just for emerging markets. This can be actively used. And again, you mentioned it in your earlier remarks. But what can be done? What the private sector in the U.S. has to scale up blended finance?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think in the United States, the concept of a domestically oriented development bank or development banking ecosystem it's not one that people think about or are familiar with. That said, a lot of the mechanisms and tropes of development banks do exist in different ways across the US, but I don't think they've ever been historically couched as blended finance. And also there's like a little bit of a legacy in the US politically about blending public and private money towards projects. It's just a little bit less familiar. That said, there's an enormous opportunity now, again, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think just generally recognizing that this is a tool that can accomplish certain kind of outcomes that might not be well suited for traditional public-private partnership structures, as Ricardo described them quite well earlier. So I think the key is that governments, when they're setting up blended finance facilities or quasi-publics or whatever the financial institution is that holds the concessional or the flexible capital, it's critical for them to engage private sector capital providers to understand what do they need, how do these need to be structured to meet their specific objectives, not just in terms of risk and return requirements, but to make it usable. For example, I actually had a conversation internally with a colleague here at Wells Fargo just last week about how new programs and potential financing structures coming out of the US government right now, I think it's all well and good for them to be designed to cover certain kinds of risks and to open up new market opportunities. But if they're not structured in a way where it's really easy for the bank to use and engage in those structures, it's a very large sort of institutional barrier for banks to engage in those conversations. And, you know, if we're talking about very, very large projects like billion-dollar ticket sizes, obviously those are going to inherently be bespoke conversations and negotiations around, you know, is the government providing a loan loss reserve? Are they taking a subordinated debt position? How is the risk actually shared? But when it comes to things like distributed energy solutions, if we're talking about rooftop solar, community solar, building efficiency, EV charging, finding ways of developing standardized structures that are going to be off the shelf, that a private bank can just pick up and use over and over and over again and scale repeatedly, that is a really good mechanism for getting blended finance to grow and be used at a much greater rate in a mature market like the US, because it's all about repetition and standardization. So much of those markets will grow depending on the ability of private banks to securitize assets and bundle them up and aggregate them so that an individual project's risk is mitigated by a collective pool. And so if we want to have blended finance facilities that are set up to enable that kind of capital market maturation, it's all about repetition and all about standardization. And some parts of the US government have done this well. The Small Business Administration, the SBA, for example, for years has had mechanisms designed to enable that kind of repeated, scalable private capital flow to underserved market sectors. And banks like Wells Fargo are very, very familiar with those mechanisms. And so I think as the US government, the federal government, and even state and local governments that are a part of this effort think about standing up their own blended finance facilities, whether they're dedicated green banks or what have you, really thinking carefully about meeting private capital where they are and hearing from them what they need, not just in terms of risk return profile, but setting it up in a programmatic way that is very easy to adopt and implement.
Excellent. I think from practical perspective, the beauty of the blended finance, it's related with its ability to reduce funding costs, right? In a rising interest rate environment. I mean, personally, I think that we will never go back to low interest rate environment. This is my opinion, by the way. So I think blended finance will become even much more important, even though in the US, we don't use that term very often. It's a perfect mechanism actually to reduce the cost of financing if it is used effectively. But that said, thank you so much, Jeff. This is excellent. Thank you. Fumihiko-san, let me switch to you here. I believe it wouldn't be wrong, but please correct me if I'm wrong, to say that blended finance is extremely vital for emerging markets. So relative to mature markets, as we discussed. But could you tell us more about how can we utilize or use much more effectively blended finance to help the bridge the substantial climate and SDG, Sustainable Development Goal needs of emerging markets? So what role has it? So could you tell us some successful case studies? Could you share your views on that? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Yeah. While private funding is essential to implementing the SDGs, I think the private sector has a difficulty designing risk-return models for climate change responses, particularly for green infrastructure and other adaptation measures in emerging markets. That's sure. And it is possible to create bankable schemes and close funding gaps by providing capital together with the public sector. So as such, the importance of blended finance is being recognized globally. In fact, the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap released in October 2021 also identified blended finance as one way to encourage private capital in social projects. And let me first introduce our successful case study in Japan. So this August, along with other Japanese banks, SMBC established JICN, the Japan Green Investment Corp for Carbon Neutrality, a public-private fund to support decarbonization in Japan. JICN is an approximately $150 million fund by investment and loans from the government, financial institutions, and industrial companies. I attended the inaugural meeting by SAFE, and SMBC will use this fund to support initiatives such as renewable energy development, installation of energy-saving equipment, and forest conservation as blended finance with the government and other banks. On top of that, the fund's investment will enable financial institutions to share their insights on risk-return analysis, which will contribute to the expansion of the blended finance market. So the JICN's target is limited to Japan. However, I think we believe that a similar scheme can be rolled out in the emerging market as well as a successful model. That's I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is really good. Ricardo, I would like to talk a little bit about your experience with blended finance in the region, in Latin America and Caribbean region. So could you tell us more about how the IDB Invest engage on this particular agenda?
Yeah, sure. And it's important to mention, and I forgot to mention before, that PPPs and blended finance are not, I mean, they can work together. You can actually have a PPP that's financed through blended finance mechanisms. And in the case of Latin America in particular, just to follow your question, we have been using blended finance, at least here at IDB Invest. You know, we're a development bank, we're a MDB. And what we've been trying to do is to use this mechanism of financing to support projects that are either innovative, like Jeff was saying. For example, I was mentioning solar cells recently for in countries that don't have solar energy, or hydrogen, for example, will be a good market. So we use blended finance to support this innovation. But not only do we do it for that, we also do it to create examples. So sometimes when in infrastructure, which is my area of expertise, although blended finance, I must say, can be used not only for project finance, but also for corporate finance. But what we do at IDB is create infrastructure examples that can be replicated with blended finance, that can be replicated, that can show the market, listen, this really works. And this can be something that you as a private investor can invest in, or as a government can invest in, because it does make sense. And here's an example. So we select projects that can have that potential to be replicable through using blended finance to develop them. So that's another area where we have used this mechanism. And last, I mean, we use it for a lot, but the last main area that I think it's important to mention is for adaptation. As you know, there's not a lot of financing that comes to adaptation, because it's difficult to either quantify, or some developers think of adaptation or serious. It would not, that's something that has to do by the public investment, not by the private investment, because there's not a clear source of repayment. It's not as clear as, for example, mitigation, that you can actually measure. You can measure your emissions. In adaptation, it's trickier. So you can use blended finance to promote this type of projects and to show again to the market that this type of projects do make sense. So that's how we use it in Latin America. And how successful have we been? Well, let's just take a quick look at the blended finance market worldwide. And I don't want to throw a lot of numbers to you, but I don't have to go through a couple of them. So according to Convergence, which is, as I mentioned, the working group of DFIs for blended finance, support with this mechanism, with blended finance, has averaged $9 billion worldwide per year since 2015. From that amount, Latin America is a small chunk. It's only 40% of that amount. But from that amount, IDB Invest represents much of the lion's share of this, between 30 and 50%. And I know it's not a clear number. We're still working on the numbers because it's not easy to quantify. But that's how much we have been involved in the market in the region. So just last year, in 2020, last year, 2 years ago, we allocated $96 million, which helped mobilize in blended, which helped mobilize $450 million on private capital and $1.1 billion on public resources. So as you can see, you can actually use a blended finance to, we've been successful mobilizing private and public investment utilizing blended finance. And our number has been growing increasingly. We have around $1.3 billion just allotted for blended finance here at IDB Invest. IFC, for example, has also resources on blended finance. Other MDBs also have the Asian Development Bank, the Africa Development Bank also do this. And it's a practice that's growing more and more. And I just want to tell you a quick two examples that I have here that I just wanted to share with you, just to see how blended finance can actually work, not only in infrastructure, but also in other sectors. So we have, for example, helped banks, financial institutions in Haiti with blended finance. So we provide financing to financial institutions to increase financing for underserved SMEs in Haiti. So you can actually, promote growth with this type of blended finance. So we provide concessional loan or blended finance to financial institutions, who in turn provide to their markets, to SMEs, in this case in Haiti, loans that have very either shorter terms and longer terms or lower interest rates. So that's one of the things that we've been doing. We can also, finally, we have also been doing it with corporates, trying to promote the growth of corporates. For example, a market chain in Latin America that operates throughout Latin America that had, they were using renewable energy for their operations. So we provided a blended finance loan to them so they could grow in the region and provide an example to other markets and chain markets in the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there's one point strikes me here. So success in order to achieve these net zero goals, achieve a low carbon economy, we need to mobilize trillions. But blended finance is not at that scale. I mean, so it looks like that we need every single penny through different vehicles. So blended finance is one of the solutions. So we really have a lot of work to do here. This is my takeaway from your intervention. But excellent, thank you so much, Tim. So what do we need to do? I mean, so to scale up blended finance. I mean, so what are the challenges, especially? How do you see the private creditors' appetite for blended finance, and how is it related with regulatory environment?
Sure, I think the regulatory issues has been a bit of a journey, I think, for a lot of us to sort of get our heads around. So I think, first of all, a lot of the investments we're talking about are long term. That can be difficult. Anything longer than 6 years, is very difficult from a capital risk weighting point of view. And then there's also just a balance sheet management preference to maintain a shorter time horizons, right? So particularly following the financial crisis. So, secondly, we know there's a lot of uncertainty with many investments. They might be sensitive to future carbon prices, subject to political uncertainty. There might be competing technologies. We don't know which one's going to win. These sort of risks might be more suitable to equity in certain senses, and that's also difficult for banks from a risk weighting point of view. So I think a lot of people had looked at these challenges and thought, okay, well, maybe some sort of green supporting factor for bank capital could help unleash some sort of capacity that could help address some of these challenges in whole or in part. But I think our sense is that that's just not the direction our regulators are going to go in. We've seen this in sort of recently from EBA consultations, from the Bank of England's recent Climate Risk and Capital Conference, for example. And I think there are good reasons why you wouldn't go down that sort of green supporting factor road. So they're rightly sort of fearful, I guess, that it could introduce some sort of disconnect between the empirical sort of basis that we have for capital requirements and risk weightings at the moment, which is sort of based on data and historical losses and that sort of thing, to a more sort of forward-looking and speculative approach. So to our thinking, this means that for banks to be participating at scale, we're not looking at capital interventions from prudential regulators to sort of save the day. I think what we're likely to be spending a lot more time talking about, as we have today, is on sort of blended finance sort of models where government balance sheets can be efficiently utilized to address some of the challenges that we face. And what I guess that we're talking about sort of different types of it could be guarantees or other sorts of blended finance tools. Now, we've already seen a lot of G20 countries come up with models to try and do this with banks. And I guess the trouble is that our regulatory framework's not especially well configured to deal with guarantees. Like we do them at scale routinely with trade finance, but that's a very specific market. And I think, often, for example, we're offered a structure where a guarantee might pay out on the liquidation of the client. Now that might offer us a commercial benefit, but it wouldn't offer us a risk weighting benefit. So I think, what we're going to need to see, if we're going to go down the road of blended finance and we're going to fully realize the benefit of the taxpayer resources that are being devoted to try and crowd in private capital, we're going to need a much more risk sensitive capital sort of environment for banks to be able to fully benefit from these. So I think, that's a conversation that's barely started, I would say, from my vantage point with our regulators. But it's definitely one that I think we need to move to quite quickly now that it's becoming increasingly obvious that sort of blunt instruments like green supporting factors are probably not the way forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you. These are really interesting points, and you're absolutely right. We need to talk more about this, and I'm sure that this is going to be a very hot topic, especially next year. So with that, I just want to ask you some brief questions. I mean, so we have less than 5 minutes left. So let's make it much more relevant with the COP27, the last round of the questions. So very shortly, could you please try to answer the following question in less than 45 seconds, not more than that. So what do you expect to come out of COP27? And do you think this will be enough to scale up climate finance? So let's start off with Jeff. Jeff?
My hope, and I think I've seen a little bit of news suggesting this, is like there's a little bit of a reality check of where climate finance is, especially from the public sector side. You know, there's been an acknowledgement that the $100 billion target is just not being met, and it's probably not going to be met in the manner in which we hoped. And so rather than sort of pursuing a pathway towards, you know, the supporting the South and developing countries in a manner in which just we're not going to do, it's better to restart and find a better way to do it and find different ways of driving the public funding to countries that need the support. And we've seen a couple of announcements to that effect already. So I'm glad to see sort of a little bit of a reshaping of the expectations and the planning around the needs to and how we are going to drive public funds to developing and emerging markets.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Fumihiko?
Yes, I think one of the focus of the COP27 is obviously financial support for emerging countries. And also, there will be more focus than ever on financing climate adaptation. So discussion on each agenda item are likely to be difficult given the current global situation. But I believe it is necessary to strengthen cooperation among the global community to expand climate finance, including blended finance. I expect that this COP27 will be a place for the public and private sector to have direct and positive engagement to deepen each other's understandings on the obstacles we need to overcome and where we can agree to best cooperate.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Ricardo, what do you think?
I agree with what has been said by Fumihiko and also by Jeff. And I think the great challenge in COP is adaptation and resiliency. And as Fumihiko was saying, it's going to be one of the main topics in COP. And I think something can come out of that. And on the other side, on the missions and net zero, I think we need to, as a world community, we need to reassess what we have been done so far and see what we can do and what instruments we can create or even use more of the financial and non-financial instruments that we have to promote the development of projects that really get us maybe not to 1.5 as the economy was saying this year, 1.5 degrees, but we know where we can mitigate the most the climate change issue. I mean, taking into account where we are standing right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the final words to you, Tim.
If we can define success very narrowly, I think to me, it's been really exciting to see the massive focus on blended finance. For a lot of us have been talking about it for a long time. It does feel like there's a real political momentum there. So I'm pretty excited about the potential for that to be translated into a lot more practical progress. And for someone who's worked on sort of these conversations at the G20 for a really long time, to me, I'm actually quite excited about that. So to me, there's some degree of success in that domain. So to me, that's a pretty good way to start.
Excellent. I mean, so optimism should be a part of the solution kit, I think. So I'm also very optimistic about the process. So what a great conversation. Really, I really appreciate your time. So this was excellent. And I want to thank you, all of you, for the quality of the discussion. And this brings us to the end of our today's COP talks. This is Emre Tiftik again. We will continue to have this series throughout the COP27 meetings. And until next time, stay safe and also carbon neutral as much as possible. Thank you.